Hello G2 and welcome to week 3 of zooming into the women of the Bible. This week we're learning about Esther, the book of Esther. So we're going to start with a bit of an overview of the story to help us understand the verses, and then we're going to zoom into Queen Vashti, and then we're going to zoom into Queen Esther. And if you're anything like me, I struggle to follow the names and the events when I'm reading the Bible because they're just so unfamiliar. So I decided to make some puppets and to tell the story in a more visual way. I don't know how it's going to go, so we'll see. I hope you enjoy.
So our story begins with King Xerxes holding a grand feast to display his wealth and power. On the 7th day of the feast, with all of his guests, he commands Queen Vashti, our first character of interest, to appear before his guests to show off her beauty. Vashti, she refuses to do so. This angers the king, leading to her dismissal as queen, and he sends her elsewhere. The king then decides to look for a new potential queen, of which he chooses Esther. Now, Esther is an orphan raised by Mordecai. Importantly, Esther, she's a Jew, but she doesn't tell the king. So the queen goes and lives with the king. The story of Esther unfolds when Mordecai, he discovers that the king's official, Haman, has a plot to destroy the Jews. Mordecai informs Esther of this, and Esther is challenged because Mordecai says, go tell the king so that the Jews aren't killed. At which point, Esther knows if he's in the inner court, then she can't go to him. She will get killed. So she tells Mordecai this, and he says, have you not been put in this position for such a time as this? At which point Esther, she has the courage and she comes up with a strategy to tell the king. So what she does is she throws a banquet. In fact, she throws 2 banquets. And at the end of the second one, she speaks to the king and she tells him of the plan of Haman. At which point the king, he gets very angry and he beheads the Haman and the Jews are saved.
Brilliant. So now we're going to spend some time discussing some questions in our group. So I'll see you in a second. Brilliant. So hopefully you've had some really good discussions with some different perspectives on that verse. When I was reading it, I was really struck by how in the society we can see just by looking at Vashti that women were quite objectified and disempowered. And the king, what he did was he said, well, I don't want other women to start doing what Vashti's doing. I want the men to be the head of the household. So he was so scared of that happening that he made a law to stop it from happening. And I think what I found very interesting was that implicitly, it tells us his implicit understanding of the influence that Queen Vashti actually had. So Queen Vashti, she had an influence because other women would have looked at her and they would have said, oh, maybe I'll do that too. And even though society disempowered women, she still had an influence to the point that the king had to put a law into place to stop it from having the influence that it was going to have. And I wonder what influence you have on other people and who might see the way you're living. We're going to spend some time now chatting about that in groups. Wonderful. So now we've learned a bit about the courage and the principledness of Queen Vashti, how she dignifies herself and doesn't comply to an unreasonable command. And she's a pioneer of feminine strength. And now we're going to move on to our second character, Esther. And we're going to read the verse. But for context, at this point, Queen Vashti has been taken away and the king has chosen Esther to be the new queen. And she's discovered from Haman that there's a plot to kill that Haman has a plot to kill the Jews. And Esther has gone to Mordecai and said, look, I can't go see the king because he's going to kill me if I go into the inner court without an invitation. So if you read the scriptures now, and we'll come back in a second. So we see here that Esther, she changes her mind quite drastically. And I wonder what provoked that. I wonder what went through her mind when she was reading that letter from Mordecai. Have a chat in your groups now. So what struck me when I was reading this, I looked in my study Bible just to get a bit of insight, and it spoke about some of the main themes that run throughout this book and how they're demonstrated in this passage. And the first one is the sovereignty of God. So you might have noticed that Mordecai said that the Jews will be delivered one way or another. That's going to happen. And he challenges Esther's role in that and says, like, is God asking you? Has he put you in the position of queen for this moment? Because either way it's going to happen, but God's asking you to do that. But we also see it's that God's will isn't fatalistic. So that means there's not one way it's going to happen. It's not predestined because we have a choice. And Esther could have chosen to not do it. And this comes into the second point of one of the themes in this book is that God asks us to play a role and we have responsibility in his plan. Interestingly, God isn't mentioned at all in the book of Esther. And while some people think there's something wrong with this, others say that this is a literary device. So it's a strategic way of the author to invite the reader to look into how God is weaving his narrative through people, through decisions, through what we might perceive as coincidences. We're invited to look for God without it being explicit. And this is what Esther's doing. She's saying, do you know what? Maybe God is asking me to do this. Maybe he is asking me to help weave his plan to bring his kingdom. And it took so much bravery and sacrifice on her part to do that, to be a part of God's sovereign plan. So we're going to zoom back out now and look at both of the queens and compare them a little bit and see what they had in common. So both of the queens, they showed integrity and principled choices. They both used their positions of influence very wisely and sought God's kingdom. They also showed selflessness and patriotism through making choices even in the face of consequence. But they did this very differently. So Queen Vashti, her strategy was to take a stand. She said, look, I'm not going to do something that's not within my principles. And she stood there with her integrity. And then there was Esther, who took action. She took strategic action. So she knew that going to the king was going to get her killed into the inner court. So she decided to throw a banquet to build a relationship with the king. And she not did it once, she did it twice, to essentially access the king and to reach him where he was at. They both used their influence wisely. They both used acts of empowerment, but they were different forms of empowerment, reminding us that strength can be found in both standing firm and in taking action. But how do we apply this to our lives today? How do we stand up for what is right? How do we use our influence wisely? And how do we seek God's guidance when we try and do that? Because when Esther, before she went to the king, we read that she got people around her. She was praying, she was fasting. Because when we take action, often there's a pushback from other people, and we need to be supported when we do that. So to finish off, I'm going to give some questions to explore how we can apply this to our lives. And then it would be great if you guys could finish by praying for each other, whether you're praying for action or standing firm, or praying for just God's courage and his love to be with you as you discover where God's asking you to be a part of his plan. Brilliant. Thank you, GT.